Sex, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the speculative interdimensional vehicle, Sex in Space. Its mission, to explore new points of view, to seek out fresh opinions, to boldly go where so many have gone before, and still somehow manage to totally miss the point. Subscribe to Sex in Space, wherever quality podcasts are found.
Today we were lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Fiona Vera-Gray, one of the UK's leading feminist academics working on sexual violence, and the Deputy Director at the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at the London Metropolitan University. Earlier this year she published her book Women on Porn, where she interviewed 100 women on their experiences with pornography, how they first encountered it, how they consume it, how it's affected their sex lives and relationships, what they like and what they don't. And that's what we're here to talk with her about today, so let's get into it. Today we are here to talk about your book, Women on Porn. And so I wondered if you could share with our listeners where that book came from and what kicked it off for you.
So I did the research back in 2017. The book was only just published. But in between that, obviously, we had the pandemic. We had lots of things happen. But it started really from a sense that the research up until that point had really focused on men as the primary consumers of pornography. I used to work in a rape crisis centre, and what I knew from that was that in prevention work that we did with young people, I was hearing very much from the girls that they were accessing pornography. So sometimes because it had been sent through from the boys, but sometimes actually accessing it themselves. And I tried to look to see what kind of research was out there around that, looking not only at young girls' use, but at women's use more broadly. And there really wasn't anything at the time that I was looking. So there was a study from, there were two studies. There was one from Canada from around 1992 or 94.
Okay.
There was one from Canada and there was one from the UK. The one from the UK used the definition of hardcore pornography in it was any pornography that showed an erect penis. And I think we can see from that, I mean, obviously now it's 30 years or something, it's a long time, but we can see how different it is, and particularly with the advent of Internet 2.0 and fast streaming access to the mainstream sites. I think since then, it really was time to do some kind of in-depth study to centre women's voices and women's experiences around pornography. So that's what I did.
And so something that you mentioned in your book is about sexual scripts and the impact that porn has on those sexual scripts. And so I was wondering if you could maybe unpack for our listeners like what sexual scripts are and the impact that porn does have on those.
Sure. So sexual scripts is a theory that's starting to be used more and more, actually, when we're talking about pornography, and it moves us in a really useful way, I think, away from thinking about cause and effect. So a lot of the times when people think about, for example, watching violent pornography, so people think, cause and effect, what we need to do violent pornography is fine unless we can demonstrate that it causes people who watch it to be violent, and then we can think about it as harmful. But human beings are much more complex than that, right? We don't just watch something and then go out and do it. There's lots of other inputs and other things that have to happen. And so sexual scripts moves us away from that and closer to thinking about how is sex, what sex is, who does it, how you do it, who it's for, how is that scripted in society? How do we understand the narrative that is around what sex is? Because sex is very cultural, right? It's not done the same way in, everywhere. There's a lot of cultural scaffolding around what we think about sex.
Definitely.
So when we think about sexual scripts, that's about, what are the main scripts? What are the main messages that we get around sex? And I think definitely true in the UK, true in Australia, possibly true in New Zealand, possibly true in a lot of countries, but I can't, there's going to be some differences. But actually what you have is a society who doesn't talk very much about what sex is, how you do it, who does it. And into that society, you've had mainstream online pornography. And what's happened a lot of the time is this script around what sex is, in porn, is taking the place of us having actual open, honest conversations about what sex is, particularly with young people, but not only with young people. So also there's some kind of shaping that's happening there with adults to think about what sex is. And in some ways that understanding, it's more complex than the idea of cause and effect. So it's not that watching violent porn makes someone go out and be violent, but it may be that watching violent porn interjects this sense that violence is sexy, that there is some kind of connection, there's some kind of eroticism in violence. And that then becomes problematic, particularly when we watch who are the vast majority of people who are using violence in pornography and who are the vast majority of people who are experiencing violence. And it replicates what we see in society. You know, it's men's use of violence against women. So that argument for me feels much more comfortable with thinking about that as being the ways in which pornography interacts with reality, rather than this idea of it causing, particularly when you talk to women, because so talking to women, some women are using pornography that they themselves talk about as being violent, but they're not going out and being violent. And a lot of them are holding attitudes that are really against violence. And so it forces us to have more nuanced conversations about what that relationship might be.
I think something that's really interesting in that is this idea of reality. And then, because there's often this example that gets used about the difference between reality and fantasy. And there's the, you know, the comparison between watching porn and the Fast and Furious. And you made a really good point about that on Politics Joe. And I wondered if you could explore that with us today as well.
Yeah, so the interviewer, Ollie, was saying, you know, I watch Fast and the Furious, I don't then go out and drive like that. And I think that that's an argument that's been used a lot around pornography, is this, you know, monkey see, monkey do thing. And that doesn't, you know, I play violent video games, I don't then go out and be violent. But particularly around the driving analogy, the difference is that you see other people driving in the street and you're also taught how to drive. You frequently drive with other people who will talk to you about how they drive or how they're, you know, and that's just not the way that sex is in society. We are not taught how to do it. We make it up. We often make it up with people who are also making it up at the same time. So no one's quite knowing what on earth you're supposed to do. And then when you have that kind of on top of that, you then have this dominant narrative coming in from a lot of the mainstream pornography sites about what sex is, you know, that sex is something that is primarily for men, that it is primarily about the male orgasm, that, you know, in the vast amount of mainstream pornography, if there's men in it, when the men come, that's the end of the shoot. Right? And so we're done. So that's the mess. That's part of the message you get in. There's a lot of really problematic raced and racialized messages that come in about women, but also about men. You know, the representation of Black men in pornography has historically just been, you know, awful, and it just still continues. But in some ways, it's in this protected space where no one is talking about it, because we're so scared that critiquing that kind of representation equates to critiquing someone's personal sexual preferences. And so it gets us into this murky space where no one wants to think about censorship. No one wants to think about interference in someone's private sexual life. And, you know, both of those things are really important. I think as a feminist, I think both of those things are really important, and I am really concerned about them. At the same time, you've got a profit-driven industry here that is, you know, making a lot of money on the fact that no one wants to regulate it for fear of infringing people's privacy rights. And I think we have to think about, how can we do both? How can we protect an individual's autonomy and privacy at the same time as think about how can we regulate an industry, because it is a different industry than Hollywood movies or video games. It's a really particular industry. On top of all of that, the relationship that you have with porn is different because you're masturbating to it. So you're actually having a different biochemical response to the material that you're consuming, as well as it being consumed in a society that we don't talk about sex in lots of other ways.
Is there any kind of advice you would give to help people feel more comfortable having conversations about sex and or porn?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't really. Let me know. I, in some ways, I guess it's a really good question. Women, on one hand, I think that we are constantly told to do things or to not do things. For example, the vast majority of my research is around sexual violence and rape, and I'm constantly asked, how do you get women to report more? And it's a bit like, well, no, women shouldn't have to do anything that they don't want to do. We need to kind of fix the system. We need to fix the structures that they're reporting to before we then encourage women to change their behavior. And in some ways, I think it's maybe similar. I think that if women don't feel comfortable talking about sex or about pornography, then that's okay. It's actually all right. You don't have to talk about anything you don't feel okay talking about. But we need to take some of the divisive nature of the debates out of it. That's one thing that I'd really like to do, and somehow, is to just stop all the judgment, stop all of the, if you use pornography, you're contributing to violence against women. If you're trying to stop the use of pornography, then you're against sex worker rights. Like, we need to take some of that out of the conversation so that women can start to feel like wherever they sit or however they feel, or even if they don't know how they feel yet, that there's a space for them to be able to talk about. I think that women in general, it's very generalization, but we're socialized to be able to talk to each other a lot about really difficult things. I think I talk to some of my female friends about things that are really hard, like, what do I want to do with my life? Or, you talk about, do you want to have children? Do you want, like, these really big questions? And this has been part of it that we just haven't really been encouraged to talk about, because the response, it just feels like such an unsafe place to have a conversation. You don't want to feel like you're judging someone or being judged. And so in some ways, we need to do some kind of cultural work to take some of that judgment and stigma out from wherever anyone stands on it. At the same time as then women, if you do feel able to have a conversation with someone about it, an honest conversation, an open conversation about it, to try it. Because one of the things that I really, at the start of this project, I did not think I would get the response that I did. So I thought I would have like 30 women. And there was like 250 odd requests for an interview. Yeah. Wow. And then at the end, I got 100 of them booked in. And the interviews were like an hour, 2 hours long. And they just went through, women talking about like just everything, the first time they had sex, pregnancies, breakups, divorces, like just everything, because we're quite good at talking to each other. And so it wasn't that women haven't spoken about pornography and their own relationship to pornography because they don't have anything to say. I feel like we haven't done it because it hasn't felt like an okay thing for us to talk about. And so I want us to try and see what it might be like to have those conversations, if that feels like something that would help us make sense of our own relationship to it.
Is there anything in particular, like when you reflect on those conversations that you had, that's really stayed with you?
Yeah, I think the conflict is the biggest thing. So a couple of things, actually. One was the conflict, because I think that at the moment, because of that divisive nature, we think that people in general who use pornography are having a good time with it, and that's why they're using it. And people who don't use it hate it and have never used it. And actually what I found was there's a mix, right? So you've got people who don't use it, who have used it, or who might use it every now and then. You've got people who do use it, who feel a bit conflicted about what they've been aroused by or what they've masturbated to. There's a massive range. And so I think that that's part of it, is that there's a range, and it's not as simple as pro-pornography, anti-pornography. And that means that it's not as simple as this idea of sex positive and this kind of quote unquote sex negative that no one really talks about, but they do kind of mention. That actually for some of the women, particularly for some of the younger women that were talking about growing up in this world where, you know, sex positive feminism is such a prominent, has such a prominent, visible voice, that's made it hard for them to be critical of pornography, because they're feeling as though to do that is not to be sex positive. When actually, when you look at the vast majority of mainstream pornography, it's not sex positive. It's saying awful things about sex. You know, it's not. It's definitely not saying things about sex as being something for women, for women's enjoyment, for women's desire. You know, women are being treated in all kinds of ways that I don't think we would be okay with if that representation was in a movie we watched or, you know, in an ad. So I think that there's that kind of, there's that thing going on. And I think the other thing that I really saw was this sense that still for women, so I spoke to women from 18 to 70 odd, and across the board, across all of them, there's this real struggle. And again, this is a general sense because I only spoke to 100 women, so there's so many different, you know, this is a part of a story, it's not the whole story. But for a lot of the women, particularly, but not only the heterosexual women, but particularly the heterosexual women, it took a long time before they started to feel like sex was, that it was okay, that they wanted sex, that they enjoyed sex. It just took a long time for sex to feel like something that was theirs. So it wasn't until kind of mid-20s, for some it was early 30s, they actually felt like they could ask for what they want or say what they wanted, tell someone if it wasn't working, that they didn't have to fake orgasms anymore, that they could say they don't feel like sex without feeling like, oh God, now I'm frigid. For a lot of the women, and I just think this is still true, and it's so sad because I'm 43 now, and I'm like, it's so sad that we've had so much has changed in my lifetime, but it feels like this is actually hasn't changed, that the first sexual experiences for the vast majority of women are pretty shitty. They're not good. They don't come, they don't enjoy it that much. They feel like they have to perform. You know, I was like, how is that? And I'm sure that women who are older than me from the 70s and have gone through the sexual revolution would be the same for my generation, would have been like, how is that? And it's like, it's the one thing that's not changing. And I think if pornography was going to do that, then it would have done that, but it hasn't. And so, and that's, for me, makes us think that it's not, again, this mainstream version of it is not really built for anyone's sexual liberation, but definitely not for women's sexual liberation.
What message would you give to women who are perhaps like consuming porn but feeling conflicted in terms of their use, in terms of maybe like what they're seeing, but then they're also still consuming it? What message would you have for them?
That there's loads of women who are feeling exactly the same way. And so there's nothing wrong with you for feeling like that. There's loads of again, some of the women in the book say it much better than I could. There's one woman, Makita, who says that that's just the thing about desire. It's messy, and human beings are messy. And she was in her 40s, and she talked really clearly about, she started to kind of be okay, like accept the messiness and just be all right with it. But there's been a massive struggle for a really long period of time. So I think, on one hand, it's okay. Just feel how you feel. But on the other, to think about, you know, are there kind of women, men, anyone really, are there safe people that you could start to talk to about some of the conflict, to maybe unpick it, to maybe think about. So I did have some women who talked about, you know, it getting to a point where actually they were starting to feel very ashamed of themselves and ashamed of their sexuality. And we live in a society that shames women enough for their sexuality, and they were starting to feel really ashamed of the things that they'd kind of masturbated to and what they were watching. They're feeling really uncomfortable with it. And there was one in particular who spoke about her sister. She started to talk to her sister about it. I think her sister saw something that she'd been watching and just said to her, like, are you sure you want to watch that? And it was the first time that someone had said that. And she didn't say it in a judgmental way. She was just kind of saying, are you sure you want to watch it? And it gave her a space to start talking about it. And when she started talking about it, she was like, I actually don't. I feel in a way, and this was something that a couple of other women said as well, I feel in a way that porn has hijacked my sexuality, that it's kind of seized my sexuality and made me feel ashamed of the things that I'm being aroused by. And so for those women who are feeling like that, a lot of them decided to start to try and go back to either using their imagination, or some would use like erotic novels, or try and use other forms of pornography. And for the ones that went back to using their imagination, they talked about the fact that actually it was quite hard at the start, that what they were doing was remembering scenes from porn, or, that it had, one woman says this thing, I can't remember what it was, but she said it was like porn had seeped its way into my sexuality. It was hard to pull it out. But that after a couple of months, it's like a muscle, you get back to it, and you can start to fantasize about things, because some of where that conflict is coming from is women's concern for the women in pornography, right? And I spoke to some women who were in pornography, and one of them was really clear, because I said to her, what would you say to women who are concerned about women in pornography? And she said, look, I mean, the vast majority of the time, just think she probably loves it. She's probably doing it because she wants to do it. Everything's probably fine. And we know that that's one of the stories, in pornography. That's absolutely true for some women. But we also know that trafficking exists. We also know that there's coercion. We also know that some people are in it and then come out of it and have no way of kind of wiping clean what they were in. They can't get rid of, particularly with the internet, again, if it's been spread across different. And I think that's part of the conflict. It's not just what you're seeing. It's thinking about, is the woman okay with this? Does she look all right? That looked actually like she kind of winced in pain. Did she want that pain? Did she not want that pain? And so in some ways, that was also part of the driver to try and go back to actually imagining things, because you can imagine whatever you want and no one's getting hurt. It's your imagination. But in pornography, it is this fine line. It is not just a fantasy, right? There is a reality. It's actually really happening. And that negotiating that fantasy reality thing, particularly for women who wanted to watch representations of kind of women's humiliation or degradation, those kind of things, sometimes that's where that conflict would come in, the sense that they could never be entirely sure if the person that they were watching was okay with what was happening.
Yeah. And in terms of the responses that you've had to the book and the work that you've been doing, can you talk us through how people have received it, and maybe like what kind of messages they've been giving to you about the work that you've done?
Yeah, so far, so it's come out now 2 months, I think, a month and a bit. What's been really interesting is that in some ways, I think I've kind of, because I just wanted to represent what the women were saying, and some of what they were saying contradicts each other. Do you know what I mean? Because some people think that, like I was saying, there's that one woman who's like, everyone in porn is fine. And then I've had other women who are like, no, the porn is absolutely awful. It's a form of violence. No one in it is okay. It's all exploitation. And I wanted to do justice to the complexity of it all. And I think in some ways doing that has meant that no one's really happy with it, because you can't grab it and go, this is a book that is anti-pornography. This gives me all of this, or you can't grab it and say, this is a book that is pro-pornography. But what's been interesting is that I've watched that kind of happen. So I had, there was one review, I can't remember what it was, but it said, this is a book that kind of is firmly in the sex positive camp. And I was like, really? Like, I'm really critical of sex positivity in it, and I've got a whole chapter about violence in it. And I was like, oh, okay, I didn't expect it to be taken up like that. So I think in some ways it's hard, because the debates on pornography is so divisive that it's very hard for someone to try and find some kind of middle ground, or stick to some kind of middle ground. And I think partially I was successful in that, and I think partially the way that it's been picked up maybe is different than I thought it would have been. It's been slotted into camps in a way that I was hoping, it can't be, but I think the camps are very, very powerful.
I mean, I think what's so powerful about it is highlighting, like you say, the complexity, and giving space for things in the middle rather than just kind of the divisive binaries.
Yeah.
And I did want to touch on for a moment the positive impacts that porn has had in some women's lives. If you could maybe speak to that a little bit as well.
Yeah, so part of it is that sense of sex was always something for someone else. So there's been a couple of the women who were a bit older So for me, porn existed when I was younger, but it wasn't like it was now. It wasn't free to access. You couldn't get as much as you can. And so women of my generation and slightly a bit younger and slightly a bit older, there was a couple of them who talked about not really discovering porn until they were in their 30s. There was one woman in particular who talks about it was after her first marriage had kind of ended and she was single, and in that marriage she'd never really had that much sexual enjoyment. It never really felt like it was something that she wanted to do. And she started going on, I think she went in chat rooms first, and then she went on porn sites. And it was a way for her to explore her sexuality in a way that she wasn't able to earlier on. So she got to see different things, and it broadened out her mind of the types of sex that are allowable, right? And this is something that other research shows about young people that, and this is not research I've done myself, so I can't verify it, but there's research showing that young people who watch more pornography have more egalitarian attitudes towards sex and gender diversity, because of some of what they've seen in pornography. So I think that's really, really interesting, on one hand, but the hesitation that I have around that is if we can see that porn can have this kind of positive impact in terms of shaping attitudes, then we have to allow for the fact that it can also have a negative impact in terms of shaping attitudes. So yeah, they might have more egalitarian attitudes towards diverse sexualities, diverse genders, but what is it doing for their attitudes towards women's role, in sex, or what heterosexual sex looks like, because all you really see in these representations in mainstream porn around heterosexual sex is this idea that it is for men, it is done to women, and that's the kind of end of it. So I think it can have, so it's had, for some women it's had this positive role in terms of spreading out their sense of what sex is and what it looks like, and that can be important because definitely my generation, and sadly in the UK, this next generation, I think it's different in New Zealand maybe, we didn't have sex education, proper sex education. It's probably one of the reasons why you're doing this. It just didn't exist. And so in some way, and I had some women say that at least the sex education that you're getting on pornography is better than nothing. It's better than thinking that all sex is a man and a woman having missionary sex to have babies in a marriage. So it shows you that other things exist. So I think it does have, it seems to have positive impacts, but my only hesitation about that is like, right, so if we allow for the fact that it has positive impacts, then we have to allow a little bit more for the fact that it also might have some harmful negative impact.
And where do you hope to see, or where do you hope to take your work in this space in the future?
I don't know, to be honest. I want a little break from porn, to be honest. I'm working on a project on police files and rape, criminal justice response to rape, which I also kind of want a break from, but that's what I'm looking at the moment. The porn is hard because I think as a researcher, the vast majority of my research has been around sexual violence more broadly. And I think, and my PhD and my primary research area was sexual harassment in public. And I think that everybody can agree that that's a bad thing. All women can talk about this is a bad thing. All women have experienced it. They know the harm of it. There's very few saying that it's not a heavily debated area. Porn is so heavily debated, and there's an additional layer then of emotional labor that you have to do. And I don't want to hurt women. I don't want any woman to feel like she's being judged or, that's just not where I'm coming from. And it's really difficult to do work on this subject because you're going to piss people off regardless. And I kind of, on top of already the difficulty of working around violence anyway, having to do the additional work around pornography to try and not, I don't want women who have been in pornography to feel like I'm saying what they've done is wrong or judging what they're doing. I don't want women who have campaigned against pornography to feel like I'm telling them that they're wrong. Like I said before, I feel like women are told too much what we should do. We're always told that what we're doing is wrong or we should be better. We're always being judged by everybody. And I kind of, in some ways, staying too much in pornography contributes to that. So I mean, the natural next thing would be to interview men about it, but I don't want to interview men about it. Because I've had some men contact me. So after like that Politics Joe podcast, because I think they have quite a big male audience, I had a couple of men contact me, and not in like a bad way. You know, you get these emails and you're like, oh God, what's I going to say? I'm sure you get some as well. But like actually in quite a good, like in a, you know, I really liked what you're saying. I've got things that I would like to tell you, blah, blah, blah. But I just, again, that's another form of labour. That's having to do, I'd have to do some safety work around that. I've got a colleague who's done research with men on pornography and sexualisation of culture more broadly. And she just had to do a whole lot of things that I didn't have to do when I was talking to women, you know, just to make sure that there's not an abusive man who's using that space as an opportunity to harass a woman or make her feel uncomfortable. So I'd love to see a male researcher jump in and do that, and have it in a way where, again, men can tell a different story than the story that they're kind of told they have to cut, which is either I don't watch any porn, or all the porn I watch is fine, or I'm completely okay with porn. You know, like to have something that's a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complex, and that maybe gets out some of the conflict, because they must have it as well. They must have it as well. So I'd be really interested in hearing from them how they negotiate it. And also younger. So because I was doing this through university, and universities are very risk averse, and so doing any research with under 18-year-olds is really, they get a bit funny about it. You can do it, but and so 18 was the lower age limit. So I had women contacting me who were like 12, 13, 14. I was like, I can't do this. But that in itself is another project. And again, to somehow try and create a space where it's not, you know, come and talk to me about how much you like pornography or how much you hate it, but just like come and talk to me about the influence and impact of pornography in your life. I think that would be really interesting, because it's that, you know, those ones, the real younger ones now, I just think they're so critical and smart and switched on about this stuff. I'd really like to hear from them what they think about, you know, the big debates and what should be done. You know, what do they want the government to do? I'd be really interested in that, and I don't think we know. Yeah, in a way that I think other people are guessing, you know, and my sense is that there needs to be a space for them to be feeding into what we're doing, because, you know, time goes really quickly, and in about 10 years, these are the people that are then going to have to make decisions for like the 10-year-olds, the 12-year-olds now. So I think creating some kind of space in the way that there's been like online platforms, for example, in the UK, there's one called Everyone's Invited, which was about, you know, young women getting young people to raise experiences of sexual harassment in their school and post anonymously. I think something like that, again, for young people, to get a broad range of young people talking about pornography and what they think the solutions or next steps are. Maybe they don't think there's a problem at all. Maybe they think there is a problem. Yeah, it'd be great to find out, but not for me. I'm moving away from it for now.
Is there anything that from this research that's really surprised you?
I've been not necessarily surprised, but it's felt good. I've done a couple of events and heard women say, like, yes, you're actually articulating something that I felt that I have not heard someone else say. And so that felt, it's not that it's surprising, but it is that thing of like, oh God, oh thank God. Because you do this kind of thing and then you think, oh, was it just these 100 women? Was there something particular about it? I did an event in Bristol a couple of months ago, and there was a young woman there who was saying, you know, she was from China, and she was saying there was no porn in China, and then she came over to study over in the UK and found porn, and so was looking on porn, and she was saying, you know, she felt really guilty about it. And she said that she'd never actually heard anyone talk about feeling guilty and still using it, you know, that it just wasn't, that wasn't, there's no space to talk about that. It's supposed to be if you feel guilty about it or you feel bad about it, you stop, you know. And I was saying that's definitely not from the women that I've spoken to. It's not. It's that you feel guilty about it and you still kind of use it. And it's just this mixed up kind of messy thing that's happening for a while. And I think while we're not talking about that, you know, you've just got these big companies making loads of money off the fact that people are feeling a bit uncomfortable with their own sexuality. So, yeah, I think that for me has been surprising but heartening to hear
Mm.
that there's some resonance more wider.
When I was reading your book, I was thinking it's very validating to hear those stories of people feeling kind of good and bad, and that it's not, it's not just me, or it's not just,
That's what I want. Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I wanted. And that's what I've heard from other people. And that's what I'm really, because that's again, like I wanted people to stop feeling, I think if we're going to talk about it, we need to feel like there's other people who feel like we do. And that was the thing that really came across from all of the women all put together, was this sense of conflict, but not like an overriding conflict that means that they're not going to use it anymore. So it was like just feeling a bit icky.
Yeah.
Sometimes maybe seeing things that you were like, oh no, that's wrong, that's gone too far, I'm not happy with that. Or finding like your own little niche of things that you search for and trying to avoid everything else that's around that.
Yeah, creating your own sort of like filter or something.
Yeah, exactly, to go through
Yeah.
it. And I just think that all of these things we haven't, I just hadn't seen them spoken about before. So that, thank you for that. That's it's heartening to hear. That's what I wanted. I just want people to feel like that how you feel is legitimate, because there's other women who feel something similar.
Well, I think the book is incredible, and to our listeners, I would definitely recommend reading it, because I think it's, again, very validating to be able to read those stories, and also to recognize, again, I think complexity comes up quite a lot in terms of just how much space there really is, and all the different reasons people are using it and what they're getting from it or not getting from it. I think as a final sort of question, is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to share with our listeners?
No, I think the one thing that I get asked a bit about is the idea like feminist porn, what about feminist porn or alternative porn or ethical porn? And I think just to say that for the women that I spoke to, there were a couple who maybe only used sites like that, but the vast majority used the big kind of free mainstream sites. And so in a way, there's been a lot of conversation in feminism more broadly about, ethical or alternative porn or feminist porn. And part of me feels like it's a bit of a red herring, because I think that, like a lot of other things in society, in the kind of marketplace, it is very rare for people to be choosing the ethical, more expensive alternative, that we know that the vast majority is this. So I think at the same time as, acknowledging that there are producers and performers who are trying to do something different, who are kind of over here doing some work, I think that doesn't cancel out thinking about the mainstream, the big stuff, how much people are using that. And I think that that's, particularly, not particularly the case, but it was definitely the case with the women that I spoke to, that they loved the idea of feminist porn in principle, but in practice they didn't use it because they didn't want to pay for it. They didn't want their use restricted to a certain number of videos. They liked the idea that you can just search for anything that you want on these big sites. And some said that actually they didn't want porn that felt more ethical, that part of what they were looking for was this. One woman, Prina, says this thing about it's like she needs a hint of non-consensualness to make it sexy. And when she said it, she was like, God, I've never thought of it like that. That's gross. But and that's what I mean. They're the conversations that I want us to have. I want us to be able to say things like that and then go, oh, what does that mean? And
where is that coming from? And
and kind of unpack it. I think that feminists have always been, we've got to think about how culture shapes us, and our sexual desire is not separate from that. It's shaped by culture. It's not caused by culture, but it's definitely, it's in the mix. And we live in a culture that is steeped in sexism, racism, transphobia, homophobia. And so it makes sense to me that some of our sexual desire is going to be tied up in that. And it's about creating a space for us to talk about that, to try and untie it, to hopefully get to a place where we feel proud of our sexuality. We don't feel ashamed of it anymore. We feel proud of our sexual desire. We feel able to ask for what we want for and what we don't want. And maybe when some of that happens, maybe some of the desire for pornography that is, representing women in a harmful way, or is actually harmful to women performing in it, maybe some of the demand for that kind of pornography will die down, because actually we won't be drawn to this, more messy kind of sex. Will actually be wanting to look for representations that feel respectful and equal and equitable.
It's that tricky sort of relationship between culture and desire, and like how much that are shaping us and what we're shaping that. Like it's a very messy relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And it should be. I mean, it should be, and it is. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think we try too hard to simplify, and we've gotten to a point. It's what's facing this generation, I think, particularly, is the struggle to not have things be dumbed down and simplified and made to feel like it should be easy. It shouldn't be easy. It should be really messy. And a lot of the times, more than two things can be true. You know, it's not this or this. It can be both of those things. So I think that when you talk to women on pornography, it's very hard to come out with a single story, because like there's so many. There isn't one. There's so many different ones, and it's just about allowing us to feel like our story is a valid part of that bigger picture.
I think that's a really lovely place for us to wrap up this podcast, and looking at all the nuance and just allowing everyone to have their own space for their own story. So thank you so much, Fiona, for joining us today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Tasha.
It's been so lovely to chat with you.
Yeah, it's been great.
We really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Before we sign off, we wanted to remind you to check out our 2 books that we have available: How to Talk with Your Kids About Porn and The Organ Education Forgot. These are both available as downloadable PDFs or in print, and you can head over to sexandspace.com to grab your copy. If you do, not only will you be educating yourself about a very important subject, but you'll also be supporting us in all the work that we do. If you'd like to support us in other ways, we'd love for you to buy some merch, which is also available on our website, and we have both mugs and t-shirts. As always, thank you so much for listening and being on this journey with us. Until next time, safe travels, and see you on the next episode.